Imagine it is a humid morning in Dallas, Texas. The date is September, in the year 2000. You are standing on the 27th floor of the Renaissance Tower. The air conditioning is humming quietly. The carpet is plush. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows looks out over a city built on oil and money. Inside a glass conference room, two men are sweating. One is named Reed Hastings. The other is Mark Randolph. They do not look like powerful executives. They are wearing cheap suits. They are exhausted. Their tiny startup company in California is bleeding cash. The dot-com bubble has just burst, and they are weeks away from bankruptcy. They have flown to Dallas to beg for their lives. Sitting across the table from them is a man who looks like a king. His name is John Antioco. He is the CEO of Blockbuster Video. At this moment, Antioco controls a $6 billion empire. He has 9,000 stores around the world. He employs 60,000 people. He is the most powerful man in the entertainment retail industry. To him, the two men across the table are just annoying insects. Reed Hastings takes a deep breath. He makes the pitch. He offers to sell his entire company to Blockbuster. He says they will run the online part of the business, and Blockbuster can focus on the stores. Antioco leans back in his expensive leather chair. He asks the price. Hastings whispers the number, $50 million. The room goes silent. John Antioco looks at Hastings, he looks at Randolph, and then, he does something that will haunt the history of business for the next century. He struggles not to laugh. He smiles a polite, arrogant smile, and he says no. He tells them that their little business is a niche. He tells them the internet is overhyped. He sends them back to the airport. That laugh was the most expensive reaction in corporate history. By refusing to spend $50 million that morning, John Antioco signed the death warrant for his own empire. Within 10 years, Blockbuster would be bankrupt. The 9,000 stores would be empty shells, and the tiny company he laughed at would grow into a $200 billion monster that changed the way the human race consumes stories. This is not a story about technology. It is a story about arrogance. It is a story about a company that was addicted to its own profits and refused to see the knife coming for its throat. This story is 7 chapters long, and we know you are going to love it. Chapter 1. To understand why Blockbuster died, we first have to respect the monster it was when it was alive. If you grew up in the 1990s, you remember the ritual. It is Friday night. You get in the car, you drive to the strip mall. You walk through the glass doors, and you are hit with a specific smell. It is a mix of stale popcorn, industrial carpet cleaner, and cheap plastic. The lights are bright, the shelves are endless. The employees are wearing blue and gold polos. This was not just a store. It was the town square of American culture. For 20 years, Blockbuster Video determined what the world watched. If a movie was on the shelf, it was a hit. If it wasn't, it didn't exist. But here's the secret that most people do not know. Blockbuster was never actually a movie company. The man who built the empire, Wayne Huizenga, did not care about cinema. He didn't care about directors or actors. Before he bought Blockbuster in 1987, he had built a different empire. He founded Waste Management. Wayne Huizenga was a garbage man. He became a billionaire by organizing the trash industry. He understood that picking up garbage was a logistics problem. It was about trucks, routes, efficiency, and scale. When he looked at the video rental business in the 80s, he didn't see art. He saw garbage cans. He realized that a VHS tape is just a physical object, a brick of plastic that needs to move from a warehouse to a store, to a customer's house, and back to the shelf. It was exactly the same as moving trash, just in reverse. Before Huizenga, video stores were tiny, dark, dirty places run by local guys. They had bad selection and weird hours. Huizenga applied the garbage logic to the movies. He built massive distribution centers. He used computers to track every single tape. He lit the stores up like supermarkets. He demanded that every store look exactly the same, whether it was in Boston or Berlin. He crushed the small mom-and-pop stores not because he had better movies, but because he had better logistics. He built a fortress of efficiency. By the early 90s, a new Blockbuster store was opening every 17 hours. It was printing money, but inside this perfect machine, there was a hidden flaw. A deep, structural rot was built into the very foundation of the business model. The company had discovered a way to make money that had nothing to do with renting movies. They found a revenue stream that was pure profit, but it required them to treat their own customers like enemies. They called it revenue sharing, but the customers knew it by a different, more hated name, the late fee. By the late 90s, Blockbuster was not just a store, it was a trap. To understand why the company collapsed, you have to look at the math of a single VHS tape. In the early days, a Hollywood movie on tape was incredibly expensive. To buy a copy of Jurassic Park or Titanic for the store, Blockbuster had to pay the movie studio nearly $100 per tape. This created a problem. If a tape cost $100, and they rented it for $3, they had to rent it 33 times just to break even. So Blockbuster made a deal with the devil. It was called revenue sharing. The movie studios agreed to sell the tapes to Blockbuster for a dirt cheap price, maybe $5 or $6 a copy. In exchange, Blockbuster agreed to give the studio a huge chunk of the rental fee every time a customer took the movie home. This solved the cost problem. Blockbuster could now flood the shelves with hundreds of copies of the new hit movie. The shelves were always full, but this created a new, dangerous incentive. Because Blockbuster had to split the rental money with the studio, their profit margins on the actual rental were thin. They needed a new way to make money that they didn't have to share with Hollywood. They found it in the fine print. When a customer kept a movie past the due date, Blockbuster charged them a penalty. This was the late fee, and here was the secret. Blockbuster did not have to share the late fee with the movie studio. That money was 100% theirs. Suddenly, the business model shifted. Blockbuster stopped caring about renting movies and started caring about penalizing customers. By the year 2000, the company was making 16% of its total revenue from late fees. That equates to $800 million a year. Think about that number. Almost $1 billion of their income came from their customers' mistakes. They were monetizing anxiety. This created a deeply toxic relationship. Going to Blockbuster became a psychological battle. You walked up to the counter to rent a comedy for Friday night, but your stomach was tight. You were wondering if you owed them money from last week. You handed your membership card to the clerk. He scanned it. You waited for the sound. Beep. The clerk would look at you. The people in line behind you would watch. And then he would say it loud enough for everyone to hear. You owe us $10. It was a public shaming. You paid the fee because you had no choice. But you walked out of the store angry. Blockbuster had broken the first rule of long-term business. You cannot build a future on customers who hate you. They had built a golden fortress, but the foundation was rotting. They had $800 million of free cash flow, but they had 60 million enemies waiting for an alternative. And 3,000 miles away, in a messy office in California, a mathematician named Reed Hastings was about to hand those enemies a weapon. Chapter 2. There is a famous legend about how Netflix started. Reed Hastings has told it thousands of times. The story goes that back in 1997, Hastings rented a copy of the movie Apollo 13 from his local Blockbuster. He lost the tape. By the time he found it 6 weeks later, he owed $40 in late fees. He was too embarrassed to tell his wife. He drove to the gym, angry at himself and angry at the system. And while he was running on the treadmill, the idea hit him. A gym works on a flat monthly fee. You pay once, and you run as much as you want. Why couldn't movie rentals work the same way? It is a perfect origin story. It has a villain, the late fee, and a hero, the frustrated customer. But there is one problem with the story. It is mostly a lie. The real story of Netflix is not about a lost tape. It is about a math problem. Reed Hastings and his co-founder, Mark Randolph, were not angry customers. They were wealthy, bored tech guys living in Silicon Valley. Hastings had just sold his software company for $700 million. He was a mathematician by training. He viewed the world as a series of equations waiting to be solved. Every morning, Hastings and Randolph would carpool to work together. They drove over the winding Santa Cruz Mountains, and they played a game. They were trying to find the next Amazon. They looked at everything. They thought about selling shampoo by mail. They thought about selling dog food. They thought about renting VHS tapes. But the math of the VHS tape never worked. A VHS cassette is a brick. It is heavy. It is thick. It contains moving parts. If you try to mail a VHS tape, it costs $3 or $4 in postage each way. That is more than the cost of the rental. The logistics killed the business before it could start. Then, in 1997, a new variable entered the equation. A friend told Hastings about a new technology coming from Japan. It was called the DVD. Most people had never seen one. It was a flat, shimmering disc, the size of a CD. It was durable, it was digital, but most importantly, to Reed Hastings, it was light. He realized that a DVD could fit inside a standard paper envelope. It could travel through the United States postal system for 32 cents. This changed the math completely. Hastings stopped the car. He turned to Randolph. They needed to test the theory immediately. They drove to a local record store in Santa Cruz. DVDs were so new, the store didn't even sell them yet. So they bought a music CD instead. Then they walked to a gift shop and bought a simple greeting card and a peach-colored envelope. They put the disc inside the card. They put the card inside the envelope. They didn't use bubble wrap. They didn't use a box. They just licked the stamp and dropped it in the mailbox. It was a test of the fundamental physics of their business. If the disc arrived broken, the company was dead. If the post office crushed it, the idea was over. The next morning, Reed Hastings drove to Mark Randolph's house. He didn't say a word. He just held up the envelope. It had arrived in the regular mail. It was pristine. And when they put the disc into the player, the music played perfectly. In that moment, standing in a driveway in California, they realized they had found the weakness in the Blockbuster fortress. Blockbuster was moving heavy plastic bricks using expensive trucks and expensive stores. Netflix was going to move bits of data using the cheapest delivery system in the world. The mailman, the red envelope rebellion had begun. We tend to look back at Netflix today as a brilliant technology company. We imagine clean offices, sophisticated algorithms, and engineers typing on laptops. But in 1998, Netflix was not a tech company, it was a factory. If you walked into their first distribution center, it didn't look like the future. It looked like a post office during the Christmas rush. It smelled like industrial glue and cheap plastic. The operation was manual, messy, and loud. They had bought thousands of DVDs, they had thousands of red envelopes, and they had a team of workers standing at long tables, stuffing discs into sleeves by hand, hour after hour. The sound of the early Netflix was the thwack-thwack-thwack of sorting machines and the ripping of Velcro. They were fighting a war of logistics. The challenge wasn't building a website. The challenge was figuring out how to get a plastic disc from San Jose to Boston in less than 3 days without going bankrupt. And the math was terrifying. To compete with Blockbuster, Netflix had to convince Americans to do something unnatural. They had to convince people to wait. In the 90s, movie watching was impulsive. You decided on Friday night that you wanted to watch a movie, and you went to the store to get it. You wanted it now. Netflix was asking you to make a list on Monday for a movie you might want to watch on Thursday. It was asking for planning. It was asking for delayed gratification. Most people hated it. In the first few years, Netflix was not growing. It was drowning. They were spending massive amounts of money to acquire customers. They had to buy the DVD for $20. They had to pay for the shipping both ways. They had to pay the warehouse workers, and in exchange, the customer paid them a small rental fee. They were burning cash. In financial terms, this is called the burn rate. It is the speed at which a company sets its own money on fire just to keep the lights on. Reed Hastings watched his bank account drain. He was losing money on almost every single shipment. The company was bleeding millions of dollars a year. The dot-com bubble was collapsing around them. Investors were panicking. The stock market was crashing. Hastings realized that his brilliant mathematical equation had a variable he hadn't accounted for. Time. He didn't have enough time to teach America how to use the mail. He was going to run out of money long before he destroyed Blockbuster. He looked at his balance sheet. He looked at the massive blue and gold giant that dominated the industry, and he came to a painful, humiliating conclusion. He couldn't beat them. He realized that the only way to save his investors' money, and to save his team, was to surrender. He needed a lifeline. He needed someone with deep pockets to bail him out. He told his partner, Mark Randolph, to pack his bags. They were going to Dallas. They were going to sell the company to the enemy. Chapter 3, to understand the mindset of Reed Hastings in the late summer of the year 2000, you have to remember what the world looked like. The party was over. For the previous 5 years, the dot-com bubble had made everyone in Silicon Valley look like a genius. Any company with a website could raise millions of dollars. The stock market was an unstoppable rocket. Greed was easy. But in March of 2000, the rocket exploded. The Nasdaq index crashed. Trillions of dollars of wealth vaporized in a matter of weeks. Companies that were worth billions one day were bankrupt the next. The air in California changed from euphoria to panic. The phone calls from investors stopped coming. The easy money was gone. Netflix was caught in the blast radius. Reed Hastings looked at his company and saw a disaster. They had a loyal group of customers, but they had no path to profit. They were still losing money on every shipment. The burn rate was eating them alive. Hastings was not a dreamer. He was a rationalist. He ran the numbers, and the numbers told him that Netflix was going to die. It wasn't a question of if. It was a question of when. He had $50 million of losses staring him in the face. He felt the heavy weight of responsibility. He had hired friends. He had convinced people to quit safe jobs to join his crusade. If the company went to zero, he wouldn't just lose money. He would ruin the lives of the people who trusted him. He faced a brutal internal debate. Option A was to keep fighting. He could try to raise more money in a terrible market. He could cut costs, fire half his staff, and hope to survive the winter. But the likelihood of success was near zero. Option B was surrender. He could find a buyer, big, rich, old-school company and sell the technology. He could hand over the keys, pay back his investors, and walk away. It would be a defeat, but it would be an honorable defeat. Hastings swallowed his pride. He chose option B. He looked at the landscape of the video business. There was only one buyer that made sense. There was only one company with enough cash to save them, and enough infrastructure to actually use what Netflix had built, Blockbuster. Hastings believed he had a compelling pitch. He wasn't going to ask for charity. He was going to offer a partnership. His idea was simple. Blockbuster was great at the stores, but they were terrible at the internet. Netflix was terrible at making money, but they were great at the internet. He would propose a hybrid model. The Netflix website would become Blockbuster.com. The red envelopes would turn blue. Reed Hastings would run the online division, and John Antioco would run the stores. Together, they would be unstoppable. It seemed like a perfect, logical marriage. Hastings called John Antioco's office. He expected to be ignored. Instead, the assistant put him through. A meeting was set. Hastings and Mark Randolph booked their tickets to Dallas. They didn't fly private. They didn't fly first class. They were trying to save money, so they flew coach. They sat in the cramped seats, rehearsing their lines. They were nervous. They were about to walk into the lion's den to ask the lion for help. They believed they were offering Blockbuster the deal of a lifetime. They had no idea that they were walking into a trap of their own making. The meeting took place in the Renaissance Tower in downtown Dallas. It is a massive, shining skyscraper that screams power. Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph walked into the lobby wearing suits they didn't like, carrying a business that was failing. They took the elevator up to the executive floor. Everything was expensive. The carpet was thick. The conference table was made of polished wood that probably cost more than Hastings' car. John Antioco walked in. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who John Antioco was. He was not a tech guy. He was a retail operator. He had made his name turning around Taco Bell and he was a man who understood physical stores, foot traffic, and supply chains. He looked at Netflix and he didn't see a revolution, he saw a distraction. Remember, this was September of the year 2000. The internet was crashing. To a man like Antioco.com, companies were just hype. They burned cash, they had no profits, and they were currently going bankrupt by the dozen. Hastings started his pitch. He explained the synergy. He explained how Blockbuster could dominate the online world. He made the case that DVDs were the future. Antioco listened. He was polite, he nodded. And then he asked the only question that mattered to him. How much? Reed Hastings didn't blink. He said, $50 million. For a few seconds, the room was dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Hastings and Randolph held their breath, waiting for a counteroffer. They were hoping Antioco would say, 40 million, maybe 30. But John Antioco didn't counter. He struggled to control his face. One corner of his mouth twitched. He was trying not to laugh. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was worse. It was a dismissive laugh. It was the laugh of a billionaire looking at a child selling lemonade for $1,000 a cup. Antioco looked at them and effectively said, the dot-com hysteria is completely overblown. He explained his logic. Why would he pay $50 million for a company that was losing money, just to service a tiny niche of people who wanted movies by mail? He had 6,000 stores. He had the brand. If he wanted to do online rental, he could build it himself for a fraction of the cost. He politely ended the meeting. Hastings and Randolph walked out of the tower. They got into their rental car. They drove to the airport in silence. But on the flight home to California, the mood shifted. They weren't sad anymore. They were angry. The humiliation in that room had clarified everything. They realized that Antioco didn't respect them. He didn't respect the internet, and most importantly, he didn't respect the customer. He thought his fortress was invincible. Reed Hastings looked out the airplane window and realized there was no safety net. There was no buyout coming. They were on their own. He turned to Randolph and decided that they were not going to die. They were going to kick Blockbuster's ass. The rejection was the fuel. Hastings went back to the office and slashed costs. He fired 40% of his staff. It was a bloodletting, but it saved the company. Netflix survived the winter. They focused on their service. They improved their algorithm. And slowly, quietly, they started to grow. For 4 years, Blockbuster ignored them. Antioco was busy counting his billions, thinking the war was over before it began. But in 2004, the giant finally woke up. And when Blockbuster decided to fight back, they didn't use a red envelope. They used a weapon that Netflix could not match. Chapter 4. For 4 years, Reed Hastings and Netflix operated in the shadows. They were like a small guerrilla army fighting a war that the enemy didn't even know was happening. But in the year 2004, the sleeping giant finally woke up. John Antioco, the CEO of Blockbuster, looked at the numbers. He saw that Netflix was no longer a joke. They had grown to millions of subscribers. They were stealing his best customers, the movie lovers, who used to spend hundreds of dollars a year at his stores. Antioco realized he had made a mistake in that Dallas conference room. But he wasn't a fool. He was a competitor. And when he decided to fight, he didn't just want to compete. He wanted to crush them. He launched Blockbuster online. At first, Reed Hastings wasn't worried. He knew that Netflix had a better website. They had a better recommendation algorithm. They had better distribution centers. He thought he could beat Blockbuster on quality. But then, John Antioco played a card that Netflix could not match. He used his greatest liability, the stores, as a weapon. He called it total access. This was a brilliant, strategic masterstroke. It solved the one problem that Netflix could never fix: the wait. Here's how it worked. You could rent a movie on the Blockbuster website. It would arrive in your mailbox, just like Netflix. You watched it, but instead of mailing it back and waiting 3 days for the next one, you could walk into any Blockbuster store. You handed the envelope to the clerk, he scanned it, and instantly, you could pick any movie off the shelf for free and take it home right then. It was the perfect hybrid. It combined the lazy convenience of the internet with the instant gratification of the store. For a customer, it was magic. You never had an empty TV screen. You were constantly swimming in movies. Reed Hastings watched this happen from California, and for the first time since the dot-com crash, he was terrified. The data was screaming at him. Netflix subscribers were canceling their accounts in droves to switch to Blockbuster. The growth curve, which had been pointing up for years, suddenly flattened. Hastings held emergency meetings. He looked for a countermove, but there wasn't one. He couldn't build 9,000 stores overnight. He couldn't offer instant returns. Blockbuster was beating them. In 2006, the Blockbuster online service was exploding. They were adding subscribers faster than Netflix. The momentum had shifted completely. The press began to write obituaries for Netflix. They said the red envelope was just a feature, not a company, and the big boys had finally taken over. Reed Hastings realized that John Antioco had found the kill switch. If Blockbuster kept this up, Netflix would run out of cash and die. But while the customers loved total access, there was a different group of people who hated it. The program was working too well. It was expensive. Every time a customer swapped a movie in the store, Blockbuster lost money on the transaction. John Antioco was winning the war for the customer, but he was bleeding cash to do it. He was betting that he could bankrupt Netflix before he bankrupted himself. It was a game of chicken. Two cars driving at each other at full speed. And just as the crash was about to happen, a new villain entered the story. He didn't care about movies. He didn't care about the internet. He cared about one thing: the stock price. Total access was the ultimate weapon against Netflix. It was bringing customers back to Blockbuster in droves. But weapons are expensive, and this one was burning a hole in the company's pocket. To the customer, the program felt like a great deal. To the accountant, it looked like a hemorrhage. Every time a customer walked into a store with an online envelope and swapped it for a movie off the shelf, Blockbuster lost money. They were essentially giving away a rental for free. John Antioco knew this. He calculated that it cost the company about $2 of profit every time a customer used the feature. But Antioco was playing the long game. He was willing to lose money today to destroy Netflix tomorrow. He believed that if he kept the pressure on for 12 or 18 months, Netflix would run out of cash, their stock would collapse, and they would either go bankrupt or be forced to sell to him for pennies. He was right. It was working. But while Antioco was fighting the external war against Netflix, a civil war was breaking out inside his own fortress. The soldiers in this war, the thousands of store managers and franchisees, were furious. Imagine being a Blockbuster store manager in 2006. Your bonus, your salary, and your job security depend on one thing: the profitability of your specific store. You need the cash register to ring. But total access broke the register. All day long, you watch customers walk through your door. They hand your clerk a mail envelope. Your clerk hands them a free movie. The transaction records $0 in revenue. You are doing the work. You are stocking the shelves. You are paying the electricity. But the online division at corporate headquarters is getting the credit for the subscriber, and your store is taking the hit for the inventory. The franchisees revolted. They sued corporate headquarters. They claimed that Antioco was stealing their inventory to prop up his website. The culture of Blockbuster began to fracture. The online team in Dallas saw the future. The store managers in the suburbs saw a theft. Antioco was caught in the middle. He tried to explain that if they didn't win online, the stores would die anyway. He tried to tell them that they had to suffer a little pain now to survive the decade. But it is very hard to tell a shopkeeper to lose money for the greater good. By 2007, the program had burned through hundreds of millions of dollars. The debt was rising. The profits were shrinking. John Antioco needed just a little more time. He had Netflix on the ropes. He could see the victory on the horizon. But in the world of public companies, time is a luxury you have to buy with profits. And because Antioco was spending all his profits on the war, he left himself vulnerable to a predator. A new investor had been quietly buying up Blockbuster stock. He didn't care about the long-term war. He didn't care about defeating Netflix. He looked at the balance sheet, saw the spending, and decided it was time to change the management. The wolf was at the door. Chapter 5. In the jungle of American capitalism, there is a specific type of predator known as the activist investor. To the public, they look like shareholders. To a CEO, they look like sharks. Their playbook is simple. They find a company that is struggling. They buy enough stock to get a seat at the table, and then they start screaming. They demand changes to boost the stock price immediately, usually by cutting costs, firing people, or selling off assets. In 2005, the most feared shark in the water was a 70-year-old billionaire named Carl Icahn. Carl Icahn did not care about movies. He didn't care if you watched The Godfather on a DVD or a cassette. He cared about one thing: shareholder value. He looked at Blockbuster and he saw a tragedy. But he didn't see the tragedy of a company losing to Netflix. He saw the tragedy of a company spending money it didn't need to spend. He looked at John Antioco's strategy. He saw the hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into Blockbuster online. He saw the $2 loss on every total access transaction. He saw the expensive plan to eliminate late fees. To Carl Icahn, this wasn't innovation, it was arson. He believed that Antioco was taking a perfectly profitable business, the stores, and lighting its profits on fire to chase a fantasy internet business. Icahn believed the stores were a cash cow. He wanted to milk the cow, not starve it. So, Carl Icahn did what he always did. He went to war. He started buying millions of shares of Block. He wrote public letters to the shareholders. He went on television. He painted John Antioco, not as a visionary trying to save the future, but as a reckless spender who was destroying the company's value. His argument was seductive because it was simple. He told the shareholders, stop spending money on the internet. Stop trying to compete with Netflix. raise the prices, bring back the late fees, focus on the stores. If they did this, Icahn argued, the company would instantly become profitable again. The stock would go up, everyone would get rich. It was the classic battle between the short term and the long term. John Antioco tried to fight back. He tried to explain to the board and the shareholders that Icahn was wrong. He told them that if they stopped fighting Netflix now, they would make money for 2 years, and then they would be dead. He famously said, if we don't do this, the company will not exist in 5 years. But Wall Street has a hard time looking 5 years into the future. They look at the quarterly report, and the quarterly report showed that Antioco was spending all the money. The tension in the boardroom became toxic. Every meeting was a fight. Antioco was the captain trying to steer the ship away from an iceberg, and Carl Icahn was the owner screaming that turning the wheel was costing too much fuel. In 2007, the war came to a vote. Carl Icahn launched a proxy battle to kick John Antioco off the board. The shareholders had to choose. Did they want the painful, expensive path to the future, or did they want the easy, profitable path to the grave? They looked at their wallets, and they chose the shark. The vote was the turning point. Carl Icahn won the proxy battle. He secured seats on the board of directors. John Antioco, the only man who truly understood the threat of Netflix, saw the writing on the wall. He was tired of fighting his own shareholders to save them. In July of 2007, he resigned. He walked out of the Renaissance Tower with a severance package, leaving the captain's chair empty. To replace him, Carl Icahn and the board hired a man who they believed would return the company to its glory days. His name was Jim Keyes. Jim Keyes was a retail veteran. He was the former CEO of 7-Eleven. He was a master of convenience stores. He knew how to sell Slurpees, cigarettes, and hot dogs. He understood foot traffic and shelf space, but he did not understand the internet. In one of his first interviews, Keyes famously said, "I've been confused by this fascination with technology. It's not about the technology, it's about the customer." He believed that people didn't want streaming or mail delivery. He believed people wanted to walk into a store, buy a bucket of popcorn, and browse the shelves. He viewed the internet not as a tsunami that would destroy the business, but just as another marketing channel. His first major act as CEO was to execute a complete He looked at John Antioco's strategy, the expensive Total Access program, and the plan to build a streaming service, and he scrapped it. He cut the funding for Blockbuster Online. He raised prices for the online service. He refocused the entire company on the physical stores. He even tried to buy the failing electronics retailer Circuit City, believing that selling TVs was the future of the video business. 3,000 miles away, Reed Hastings watched this happen with absolute disbelief. For 3 years, Netflix had been fighting for its life against John Antioco. They were bleeding cash, they were losing subscribers, they were on the ropes, and then, suddenly, the enemy just stopped fighting. When Jim Keyes cut the Total Access program, the pressure on Netflix vanished overnight. The subscribers who had left for Blockbuster came flooding back. The cash burn stopped. The stock price recovered. It was a miracle. Reed Hastings didn't win the war because he was smarter. He won because his enemy committed suicide. By listening to Carl Icahn and chasing short-term profits, Blockbuster had given up the only weapon that could have saved them. They chose to milk the cash cow for a few more quarters, ensuring that they would have zero future in a few years. Jim Keyes had effectively steered the Titanic back toward the iceberg because he wanted to save money on the lifeboats. With the threat of Blockbuster gone, Reed Hastings was finally free. He no longer had to worry about survival. Now, he could worry about the future. He looked at the speed of the internet. He saw that broadband was finally becoming fast enough to carry video. He realized that the red envelope, the thing that made his company famous, was just a temporary bridge. He was ready to burn the bridge. Chapter 6. With Blockbuster retreating into its retail fortress, Reed Hastings was officially the king of the DVD market. The red envelopes were iconic. The mail sorting centers were running efficiently. The money was finally pouring in. Most CEOs would have popped the champagne. They would have looked at their profitable, dominant DVD business and protected it at all costs. But Reed Hastings was paranoid. He looked at the DVD, and he didn't see a golden goose. He saw a corpse. He knew that shipping plastic discs across the country was a clumsy, temporary solution. It was just a placeholder until the internet got fast enough to replace the mailman. He had named the company Netflix, not DVDs by mail, for a reason. In the year 2007, he decided it was time to kill his own business. He gathered his engineers and told them to build a streaming service. You have to remember what the internet looked like in 2007. YouTube was just a baby. Most people still had slow connections. Watching a video on the internet was a painful, buffering nightmare. When Netflix launched its streaming feature, which they called Watch Instantly, it was terrible. Imagine sitting in front of your bulky computer monitor. You click play. You wait. The little circle spins. Finally, the movie starts, but it looks like a mosaic of blurry squares. The sound is tinny. If your roommate checks their email, the movie stops. And the selection was even worse. The Hollywood studios refused to give Netflix the rights to good movies for streaming. So the library was full of B-movies, old documentaries, and films nobody wanted to watch. The critics laughed at it. They said nobody would ever trade the high-quality picture of a DVD for the grainy, buffering mess of the internet. But Hastings didn't care about the quality today. He cared about the trend line. He saw that internet speeds were doubling every year. He knew that eventually, the blur would disappear, and the convenience would be addictive. He made a radical decision. He decided to include streaming for free with every DVD subscription. This was dangerous. He was essentially telling his customers, stop using the expensive DVDs that make us money, and start using the cheap streaming that costs us money. He was cannibalizing his own revenue. His investors were confused. Why would you distract people from the core business? Why waste money on technology that barely works? Hastings understood the innovator's dilemma. He knew that if he didn't build the thing that killed the DVD, someone else, maybe Apple, maybe Google, would do it for him. He preferred to be the assassin of his own company rather than the victim of someone else's, so he pushed harder. He offered bonuses to engineers who improved the streaming quality. He struck deals with electronics companies to put Netflix buttons on remote controls. Slowly, the picture cleared up. The buffering stopped, and customers realized that clicking a button was infinitely better than waiting for the mailman. By the year 2010, Netflix wasn't a mail company anymore. It was a streaming giant. But success made Reed Hastings arrogant. He started to believe he could do no wrong. He looked at his two businesses, the dying DVD arm and the exploding streaming arm, and he decided to rip them apart. In 2011, he made a decision so bad, so tone-deaf, and so universally hated, that it almost achieved what Blockbuster failed to do. It almost destroyed Netflix in a single month. In September of 2011, Reed Hastings decided to fix something that wasn't broken. He looked at his company and saw two different animals tied together. He had the DVD business, which was profitable but dying, and he had the streaming business, which was expensive but growing. He decided to cut the rope. He sent out an email to millions of subscribers. It was a long, wandering message. In it, he announced that Netflix was splitting in two. If you wanted to stream movies, you would stay with Netflix. But if you wanted red envelopes, you would have to go to a new website called Quick. It was a disaster from the first sentence. First, there was the price. If you wanted to keep doing exactly what you were doing yesterday, getting DVDs and streaming, your bill went up by 60%. Second, there was the hassle. Suddenly you needed 2 logins, 2 credit card charges, 2 queues. You couldn't just search for a movie and decide whether to stream it or order the disc. You had to check 2 different websites. And third, there was the name Quickster. It sounded cheap. It sounded like a failed startup from the 90s. The backlash was instant and nuclear. For a decade, Netflix had been the cool, customer-friendly company. Now, they looked like the greedy corporate villain. The internet exploded with rage. Customers felt betrayed. They felt like Hastings was treating them like ATM machines. In the span of a few weeks, 800,000 people canceled their subscriptions. The stock market reacted with violence. In July, Netflix shares were trading at $300. By November, they had crashed to roughly $60. 75% of the company's value evaporated in 90 days. Reed Hastings had committed the cardinal sin of business. He made his product harder to use and more expensive at the same time. He was sitting in his office watching the ticker go down, and he realized he was about to do a blockbuster. He was about to destroy his own company through sheer arrogance. But this is where the story of Netflix diverges from the story of Blockbuster. When John Antioco was firing the online team, or when Jim Keyes was doubling down on retail, they refused to admit they were wrong. They stuck to the plan even as the ship sank. Reed Hastings looked at the data. He looked at the angry comments, and he did something incredibly rare for a CEO. He apologized. He recorded a video. It wasn't a slick corporate commercial. It was just him and his co-founder, Andy Rendick, standing in front of a white wall. Hastings was wearing a blue button-down shirt. He looked nervous. He looked humble. He said, "I messed up. I owe you an explanation." He admitted that he had moved too fast. He admitted that he had ignored the customer. And then, he killed Quickster. He abandoned the plan. He put the two services back together. He ate the humiliation. He kept the streaming focus, but he stopped trying to force the customer to change before they were ready. It was a painful, embarrassing moment. The press mocked him. The Quickster jokes lasted for years, but that apology saved the company. It stopped the bleeding. It brought the customers back. It proved that the difference between the winner and the loser wasn't about making mistakes. Both Blockbuster and Netflix made massive, billion-dollar mistakes. The difference was that when Netflix drove off a cliff, they hit the brakes and turned around. When Blockbuster drove off a cliff, they pressed the gas. Netflix survived the near-death experience. They rebuilt their stock price, brick by brick. And while they were healing, their old enemy was finally taking its last breath. Chapter 7. While Netflix was recovering from its self-inflicted wounds, Blockbuster was entering its terminal phase. By the year 2010, the blue and gold fortress was crumbling. The debt that Carl Icahn and the board had refused to pay down had become a mountain. The customers had left for Netflix or Redbox. The cash flow from the late fees had dried up. In September of 2010, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. It was a quiet end to a noisy giant. But the real tragedy wasn't the legal filing. It was what happened in the strip malls of America. If you walked into a Blockbuster in 2011, it was a ghost story. The bright lights were still on, but the magic was gone. The smell of popcorn was replaced by the smell of dust. The rows of shelves, which used to hold thousands of movies, were picked clean. The blue carpets were stained. Taped to the front windows were the signs that signaled the end of an era. Everything must go. Store closing. Fixtures for sale. They weren't just selling the movies. They were selling the shelves. They were selling the candy racks. They were selling the computers. They were stripping the carcass of the company for parts. For the employees, it was devastating. 25,000 people lost their jobs. These were the store managers who had warned corporate about the internet. These were the clerks who had worn the blue polos. They were left with nothing. Meanwhile, the financial sharks who had engineered the collapse walked away fine. Carl Icahn, who had blocked the online pivot, lost money on the trade, but he remained a billionaire. The executives had golden parachutes. The pain was felt entirely by the workers and the customers. There is a specific sadness to a dead retail store. It is a physical monument to a bad decision. Every empty Blockbuster was a tombstone for John Antioco's strategy. In Dallas, the Renaissance Tower, where Antioco had once laughed at Reed Hastings, was just another office building. The power had shifted 3,000 miles west to Los Gatos, California. Reed Hastings didn't celebrate the bankruptcy. He knew it was a warning. He looked at the empty Blockbuster stores, and he saw the ghosts of his own potential future. He knew that the only reason he wasn't the one liquidating his shelves was because he had been willing to cannibalize his own business before someone else did. Blockbuster died because it fell in love with its product, the physical store, instead of falling in love with its customer. They thought they were in the video rental business, but they were actually in the entertainment convenience business. When the definition of convenience changed, they refused to change with it. They held on to the late fees like a life raft, not realizing it was actually an anchor dragging them down. Today, there is exactly one Blockbuster store left in the world, in Bend, Oregon. It is a tourist attraction. People go there to take selfies and buy t-shirts. It is a museum of a lost civilization. But the real legacy of Blockbuster isn't in Oregon. It is in the cloud. It is in the fact that every time you press play on your remote, you are dancing on the grave of a $6 billion mistake. The story of Netflix versus Blockbuster is often told as a simple story about technology. People say, the internet replaced the video store. It feels inevitable, like the car replacing the horse. But that is the wrong lesson. Blockbuster did not die because they lacked technology. They had the money, they had the brand, and they had the opportunity. John Antioco built a working streaming service in 2006. He had the weapon in his hands. Blockbuster died because of a psychological failure. They were addicted to their own success. The fatal poison was the late fee. That single line item on the balance sheet, $100 million of pure profit, was the thing that killed them. It was a golden handcuff. To survive the future, Blockbuster had to voluntarily cut off that revenue. They had to be willing to lose money for 3 or 4 years to build a subscription model. But the board of directors, led by Carl Icahn, refused to take the hit. They chose the comfortable profit of today over the survival of tomorrow. This is the brutal truth of the innovator's dilemma. Big companies rarely die because they are stupid. They die because they are logical. It is perfectly logical to protect your biggest profit source. It is perfectly logical to fire a CEO who is spending too much money. But in a time of disruption, logic is a death sentence. Reed Hastings survived because he was illogical. He was willing to cannibalize his own business. He destroyed his profitable DVD sales to build his unprofitable streaming service. He was willing to hurt his own company before someone else did it for him. Today, the Netflix campus in Los Gatos, California, is a monument to that philosophy. It is a $200 billion empire built on the grave of the video store. And somewhere in the history books, there is that moment in the Renaissance Tower in Dallas. We can look back and calculate the cost of John Antioco's laugh. He could have bought the future for $50 million. That is less than the cost of opening a few dozen video stores. Instead, he saved the money. He kept his $50 million. In exchange, he lost everything. The ultimate lesson for every entrepreneur is simple. If you are not willing to kill your own cash cow, someone else is sharpening the knife for you. History does not care about your past profits. It only cares about your ability to let them go.